welcome back. Hope you've all joined. Okay, so let's continue. So as we mentioned that this session will also be related to the DAC criteria. And today with us, we have Mr. Kieran Crawley, Independent Evaluation Consultant. He will be taking the session, and the session is about asking relevant questions using the DAC criteria. So following Megan's session, I think it's really nicely set the floor that we will learn more about how to use the DAC criteria. So over to you, Mr. Kieran.
Thanks very much. My name's Kieran Crawley. I'm an educator, researcher, and practicing evaluator. And it's really a great pleasure to be invited to facilitate this discussion session on asking relevant questions using the DAC criteria. Over the past couple of days, we've learned about the importance of focusing on results for policy making. We've learned about the concept of the theory of change. During yesterday afternoon's panel discussion, we asked hard questions about the real challenges of focusing on results as part of policy making. Just earlier today, we have heard from Megan Kennedy-Choyne about the OECD DAC learning criteria and how these can help us to construct relevant questions to ensure that evaluations are useful. I was interested that Sanjeev earlier made the point that we really need to reflect on our own interventions, interpret the DAC criteria, and perhaps even come up with some of our own criteria to make sure that those evaluations are really context specific and useful. So with this session, this is now an opportunity for us to take a breath and reflect on what we've just heard. We can explore how we can relate these criteria to our own experience and decide on what we might do differently now that we've got this new knowledge under our belt. So I hope this is going to be a really interactive session. And for that to happen, it's important that you have plenty of contributions to the conversation. We'll run the session for approximately 45 minutes. And maybe just to get us started, I can share a few guidelines for how I think the discussion section might run. So, as I said, the session is asking relevant questions using the DAC criteria. And to really make the discussion participative and interactive, we really need to hear from you. So a few tips. First of all, please keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking. Please raise your hand if you'd like to contribute. That way, you come straight to our attention, we get to see your name, and we can invite you to share. Do keep your contribution short because there are many of us here today. So 1 or 2 minutes each should give plenty of people to interact and to share their insights. If the conversation moves on, and I hope it will, to cover a wide range of topics that have been generated by the last session, then maybe contribute to the new topic rather than refer to one of the topics that we've already covered. And as before, please do use the chat bar to share your ideas and insights with your colleagues. That's really a great way to share ideas with those who are with us today. So let's get started. Megan mentioned that the criteria are not a methodology, but really help support critical thinking and help us ask the right questions in terms of evaluating policy or programs. In Megan's session, she asked you to think of an intervention that you're involved in or you might want to evaluate. I think she even asked you to write down the name of the project or the intervention, its primary objective. And then as she went through the criteria, she asked you to come up with 1 or 2 evaluation questions for each criteria. So let's revisit that exercise because I think that was a really helpful one. And what I'm going to do to ask you to get the ball rolling is maybe to again share with us by raising your hand the objective of the intervention that you identified, and maybe give us 1 or 2 examples of evaluation questions that you were able to construct using the DAC criteria that she described. So I'll just give you a few moments. As soon as anyone's ready, please raise your hand and share the objective of the intervention that you identified and one or two evaluation questions that you constructed using those DAC criteria. Okay, I have a hand from Yatwin Diwakar. Go ahead, Yatwin.
Hello. So the intervention that I evaluated, this is from a real life example. I did the study a couple of years ago. There was one NGO which was working on eradication of malnutrition in a tribal area in India. They were working in an area where government programs were already being implemented but were not effective. So their main objective was to fill in the gaps in the government program, to identify what the government programs are lacking, and just ensure that those interventions are added to the government system to have better reach of the program. So when we started evaluating it, with the main activity that we had identified was that they are ensuring transport of the children from remote villages and habitations to the primary healthcare centers for their checkups and for giving them medicines, which was the main issue in that area. Like, people had to travel more than 10 kilometers one way to reach the hospital and so on. So when I was looking at the evaluation, relevance and coherence criteria were my primary concern initially. I wanted to understand how their intervention was fitting with respect to the existing government intervention, what other NGOs were doing in the same area, and what this NGO was doing, what were the overlaps and what was the additional gap filling that they were doing. That was how I was looking at coherence. And in terms of relevance, I was looking at how the government machinery appreciated their program, what they were expecting from them, and when they were saying that they're filling in just the gap to have maximum output, were they actually just filling the gap, or were they doing something else? So that was how I was looking at the program.
Okay, and what a great example. So a nutrition program in one of the remote areas, I think you mentioned an indigenous area, looking at getting families and children to clinics in order to receive healthcare. And you talked about two questions that you generated using the criteria coherence and relevance. Okay, a great example. That's got us rolling. Anyone else like to share an example of an intervention that they're familiar with, the objective, and perhaps a couple of evaluation questions that they've been able to generate using the DAC criteria? Raise your hand. Okay, I'm maybe going to call on another one of my colleagues who said earlier that they'd be prepared to contribute something. I'm going to ask Sakeo Moche, who's co-leader of Val Youth Pacific and an M&E assistant at UNFPA. If you're with us, would you like to have a go at answering this? Perhaps sharing some of the evaluations that you're familiar with and how you've used the DAC criteria to generate some questions. Sakeo? Maybe Sakeo isn't with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
My profound apologies. It's raining here in Fiji, Suva, and I'm having interconnection, but I'll try and contribute. So I think one of the, looking back, I'd like to share one of the projects that I'm involved in, and that is the establishment of Youth for Integrity program to advocate for anti-corruption here in Fiji. And I guess looking at the criteria, in terms of relevance, the question that I can ask is really in terms of relevance, to what extent was the Youth for Integrity program design and implementation aligned with the Global Transparency International Strategic Plan, and as well as the regional and national needs and development priorities? That's a question that I think I can ask in terms of of relevance. And in terms of coherence, I guess the question that I can ask is, to what extent was the Youth for Integrity program design and implementation compatible with regional and country programming, with particular attention to some of our programming in the provinces here in Fiji, and the work of our donors and development implementing partners here in Fiji. And in terms of effectiveness, I think we can ask the questions whether the program have achieved its intended program outputs, whether the outputs contribute to the outcomes, whether the what are some of the things that affect the achievements, and whether the program, the Youth for Integrity program, and on active, and to really use it as a basis to develop data collection tools and different methodologies and approaches to get all the information that is needed from the duty bearers and right holders. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sakeo. And what sounds like quite a complex project, tackling corruption, but you mentioned coherence both with international frameworks around tackling corruption, but also local frameworks and priorities there. You brought in the criteria of relevance and also effectiveness. So great, a good example of generating questions using those three criteria. We have a hand up from Mr. Maha Salman. Would you like to go ahead and share?
Karen, I just want to direct you to the chat. So Shakira has posted a great example also. Maybe we can ask her to unmute her mic.
I've seen that, yes. Shakira, would you like to unmute and just take us through the program that you identified and some of the questions that you were able to generate using the DAC criteria? Please go ahead, Shakira.
Sorry, I can't share my screen, but I've just typed in. This is Shakira, and I'm a young and emerging evaluator, Young Uganda Evaluation Association. So, basing on the parish development model that was created by the Office of the Prime Minister to eradicate poverty within the parishes. Because I'm a district woman councillor, I have been watching this intervention and seeing how, because the public is saying they do not see how it's going to help them. Basically, because the available resources they see the available resources are limited. They are not enough for what they want to carry out. So that takes us back to you're not involving us, anything for us, anything for us. I don't remember how that statement was stated, but I even remember Josephine mentioning it. But in case you're not involving us, then what you're doing is not for us. So I'm considering this evaluation criteria to come up with those questions, given the just the way I've put them up there. Like, for example, the parish development model is to increase household incomes and improve quality into the money economy, as well as eradicating poverty and vulnerability in both urban and rural areas in Uganda. Now, I wanted to use that, considering one of the objectives of the intervention, I wanted to consider capacity building for SMEs, strengthening private sector capacity to drive growth and create jobs through capacity building. So now, using this criteria, I'm asking, will it increase household if at all those small and medium enterprises are given training on how to manage their businesses better, how to use evidence to make decisions or check their performance, is it going to increase on the household income, where they come from? Are the available resources given to them enough? Did government sit down with these people to know that, okay, whatever we have is, or they're just giving them what is available? Or are they giving them what is actually just enough for them to move forward in case they need finances to run their businesses? Does it match with the current economic situation? Will the available resources be utilized by those same people, the beneficiaries? Can the beneficiaries continue without more support? All those questions, getting them from this criteria, considering the criteria. And of course, I'm sure more questions can come out from, if someone follows the criteria, there can be more questions, and it requires teamwork.
That's great. Thanks, Shakira. And I think you've given us some very good examples.
Right?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of using the DAC criteria is to really be clear about which criteria we're answering using particular questions. But I can immediately see there are questions in there about sustainability, effectiveness, efficiency. The process is one that takes time, but I think you're well on your way to using those criteria to generate very important questions about that project. I want to take the conversation on a little bit. So I think we've had some good examples of how people have generated questions using the criteria. But I'd like to ask you just to think about the criteria which you find easiest to formulate evaluation questions around, because these criteria are not always equally obvious when we try to contextualize them. Which for you are the easiest criteria to generate questions around? And again, if you have thoughts on that, please raise your hand and share with us. I see we've already got a response from, let me see if I can pronounce your name, Erdenetcheming. Please, would you like to say a little bit more about your response? You've said that effectiveness is the easiest criteria to.
Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Out of the 6 OECD DAC criteria, I feel effectiveness is more straightforward than the other ones, because it's mostly we're evaluating the objectives that's set in the beginning of the project or program. So it's quite clear. And then the data there, usually monitoring and evaluation specialists in the organization, they usually track the data in terms of the objectives they set. So in my experience, I would say this effectiveness is quite easier than the others. Thank you.
Yeah. That's a good point. Effectiveness is often closely related to our results framework, if we have one. So measuring effectiveness is often straightforward, and we may regularly have the data available to us to measure that one. Okay, there's another suggestion from Pantaleon Shoki that relevance is the easiest criteria to measure. Do you want to share, Pantaleon, with us why you think relevance is the easiest criteria to measure?
I should be studying now. Yes. Yes, I'm Pantaleon Shoki. I'm a Tanzanian and a member of the Tanzania Evaluation Association.
Please go ahead.
I think relevant earlier to generate some questions, as it is based on addressing the real problem that the project or policy wants. So in a nutshell, relevance to me is easy. and to manipulate around. Thank
Yes.
you.
So relevance, as you rightly pointed out, really is centered around the extent to which the intervention is meeting the needs of the target group, or what Megan described as the beneficiaries. If it's meeting their needs, then it's a relevant intervention. If it's not meeting their needs, then of course, relevance has to be held in question. Interestingly, the only real way we can really truly measure relevance is by going out and speaking to those people who are deeply engaged with the project. We also have a comment from Maha Salman, again, relevance. Maha, would you like to give us additional insights as to why you think relevance is one of the easier?
If I may add to the question, if I may add to the conversation that's happening. So I also feel that relevance would be my preferred criteria. Reason why is that because when we design an intervention, we want to look at the problem, not the solution first, but at the problem. And when we think about the problem, then we first need to see what we need to do about the problem. What is the problem? And when we try to answer that questions, I think relevance of all, amongst all the categories, I think relevance is something that stands at the top, for me at least, that I want to know what really is the problem, what is the scope of the problem, what is the extent of the problem, what is the context. So that all plays, ties better with relevance for me. So I, again, like Pantaleon, would go with relevance.
Okay, so I think your point there is that because the nature of the criteria relevance, it's so closely tied with the, if you like, the problem that we're trying to solve, it's central often to the project design. And it's one of the first things that we look to if we want to evaluate the project. Is the project actually solving the problem, the needs of the people who we targeted in the first point? Okay, that's great. So we've talked a little bit about the criteria that are perhaps easiest to construct evaluation questions around. I want to pose you another question now. Let's hear about which criteria you find the most challenging to formulate evaluation questions around. And maybe we can hear a little bit about why you think some criteria are more challenging than others. So which criteria do you feel is particularly challenging to formulate evaluation questions, policy evaluation questions around? Okay, we have Kensho Zangmo, who has highlighted coherence. Would you like to say a little bit more, Kensho, about why you find coherence a challenging criteria? Please feel free to unmute, Kensho, and share your thoughts. Please go ahead, we're listening. Okay, we can't hear you, Kensho. Maybe there's a technical issue, so I'm sorry about that. Maybe we'll ask for someone else to step in. Who else feels that coherence is a challenge with coherence? We already heard from Megan that there are many dimensions to coherence. Who would like to share with us their thoughts on that?
Hi, I'm Viswaranjan Baras from India. In my view, actually, this sustainability is most challenging to capture. The reason is how to define sustainability, what are the parameters of sustainability, and how we'll see envisage means till it's definitely long term, and how we'll define that duration, and how after this completion of the intervention, how this can be sustainable. It's actually a little bit tricky and challenging for the evaluators, I think.
Okay, so your view is that sustainability is one of the most challenging criteria, certainly to achieve. And what about asking evaluation questions around sustainability? What sort of questions do you imagine we need to ask if we truly want to determine whether an intervention is sustainable? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, if we'll, for example, some of the aspects which should be emphasized is whether there is this sustainable institutions which can carry forward the interventions even after completion, whether communities will actually continue to do the activities, or is there any change of the behavior of the communities in this adapting something? It actually depends on the context and depends on the type of intervention, but means how the status of these institutions, the communities, what is their preparedness, and of course there are other factors, risk factors, like for example financial factors, environmental factors, political factors, and all these should be actually considered when we are thinking about sustainability.
Yes, I think you're very right. Sustainability, first of all, is a challenge in itself in a program or a policy. There are so many factors that can influence the sustainability of a program or policy. So being able to craft the right questions to ask also becomes challenging. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, I can see that Amol Shaila Suresh has mentioned impact. Impact as one of the DAC criteria is a very important one, but Amol suggests that that's a difficult one to construct strong evaluation questions around. Amol, would you like to share your thoughts on that with us?
Yeah, so I think impact is a little tricky or difficult to frame the questions, because a short-term outcome and output, it's easy, but to imagine how long-term impact of the intervention, it's a little difficult, because it includes system change, behavioral change, the things which are difficult to quantify. So that's why I thought that impact would be a little challenging. Thank you.
So impact is certainly challenging to measure. I mean, often we are asked to measure impact once a project has been completed. But in reality, we may need to go back to a program or policy 5 or 10 years later to see if it really has had impact. So again, crafting the right evaluative questions to really uncover impact can also be a challenge. Okay, those are great comments and observations about the criteria which you find challenging. Let's move the conversation on a little bit. Megan made the point that criteria should be contextualized to individual evaluations, to the actions being evaluated, and also to the stakeholders. And this is clearly really very important if we're going to use the criteria in an effective way. So I'm going to take us back to that exercise that Megan asked us to think about. Remember, she asked you to think about a particular intervention and then to generate some evaluation questions based on the criteria that were focused on your particular policy intervention. I wonder if any of our participants maybe can give an example of how they might have contextualized a particular criteria to the context which you have experience in working in. Are you able to share any examples of how you might have contextualized the criteria to your particular environment or your particular situation? We have participants from a wide range of countries and contexts, political and social environments. What are your thoughts on how you might contextualize some of the DAC criteria?
let me put up my ideas.
Pantaleon, please go ahead.
Yes, this is Pantaleon from Tanzania. Contextualizing the DAC criteria, I think, is the fundamental elements while doing this, the policy evaluation or program, because whatever we do in the based on particular context. So the same applies when you're trying to evaluate a particular policy. One has to put in mind what was the context behind which brought up those policy issues to be addressed, and why do you want to address them? Because the context keep on changing. Remember, we just went through the recent pandemic. Pre-COVID situations was quite different from the post-COVID situations. And I'm quite sure there are some issues now for evaluators to look in the context of pre-COVID and the post-COVID, though you might find the same policy is still running and hasn't changed, including changes in the implementation of that particular policies. And this also affects the associated, strategies and frameworks that make sure that particular policy exists. So contextual analysis is fundamental when doing this evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pantaleon, and you're quite right. You give a very good example of how the COVID pandemic changed the context for a whole range of development policies and programs. And when we come to evaluate those programs, then we have to contextualize those criteria of effectiveness, impact, relevance, sustainability, and perhaps think about them a little bit differently if that context is very different. I wonder if any other participants can share their experience of a very particular context that they've worked in, where they've had to think carefully about how they evaluate programs or policies that they may be focusing on. Would anybody else like to relate something from their own experience? I'm wondering just about the current context, which we have, of course, which has emerged after the conflict in Eastern Europe, which has had ripple effects across the globe in terms of food security and supplies and energy. Has anyone anything to share about how that changing context has changed the way that they think about criteria for measuring the effectiveness or impact of any of their programs? Okay.
Excuse me.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, can I share about the sustainability one? So earlier this year, I was evaluating the European Union funded evaluation. The topic was about climate change and how a young generation would change their behavior and attitude towards climate change and biodiversity. And of course, in the sustainability question, there were not really a question about the unintended either positive or negative effects. But during the interviews with the children, some of the children were saying because they learned about this behavioral change topic and they got involved with some of the activities, their attitude towards loving the nature and then taking care of I'm from Mongolia, so we are in the countryside, we have nomad children. So just usually they would like to go to city and pursue economic prosperity, but because of now this project, they changed it, they rather would like to stay in the countryside and preserve the nature itself, and maybe even spreading the knowledge and then attitude to their communities. So it was very good unintended positive effect. But so sustainability is usually, then I had to change some of the questions during my evaluation. So sustainability was quite like a lot of with the unintended effects. And also nowadays we're talking about transformative change. And also I think that would be, we have to think about how we then look at the sustainability criteria from the transformative change. So I think the system is very challenging, but it's very make us think critically and make more innovative.
Goodness, and thank you for sharing what sounds like a fascinating example. Working with rural communities, if I understand it, around climate change funded by the European Union. But when you get movement of people from very rural, remote areas to other populated areas, then of course, sustainability of results, you have to measure that and think about that in a different way. That's great. I'm just looking at the chat box and I see there is a comment from April Nakaima. And they're telling me that they're wondering when an intervention is particularly innovative, if it's very different from the usual programs, if the context it is perceived as not relevant or coherent. So that's an interesting point. If it's a very innovative or different program, does that mean that we have to think about relevance and coherence in a slightly different way? Would you like to say a little bit more about that, April?
Sure. I think, well, I was just thinking in terms of sometimes people don't always, like the beneficiaries sometimes may not always realize what they need. And so, or even the funders may not know what is needed. Even if you've done some sort of needs assessment, the actual solution might be quite surprising. What works might be surprising. And so I was thinking that if you have something that's very innovative, sometimes it might get judged as being not relevant, or it doesn't fit in with the other programs in that community. So I was just wondering, maybe I was just throwing that out there, as that when we're evaluating it, like normally relevance seems pretty simple to figure out if it's relevant or not, but sometimes I think it could be trickier than we think, because like I said, the solutions to some really wicked problems aren't always sometimes it's surprising what actually works. And certainly many smart people have tried to impact some of these difficult problems and found over all these years that they don't work that well. And we are still trying to figure out why they didn't work that well, right? So I think that a lot of these questions are, it seems like it should be simple and easy, but it's tricky. It's trickier than it thinks. And I always think evaluation is kind of like common sense. Like in evaluation, we ask very practical questions, but I'm always surprised by people who are new to evaluation or don't know evaluation, that it actually takes a long time to really become a good evaluator. And I think that's because it seems like it should be easy and obvious, but actually all these questions we ask are not that obvious. And I mean, they're about things that you really have to keep asking yourself the question over and over, because when you think you've got the answer, you may not. And so I was just asking that sort of rhetorically, not really, I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I do think when you have innovation, it gets it either gets over, people are like, oh, it's innovative, and they get overexcited, or they think that's too weird, that is not, or that's too simple or something. And so it gets overlooked. So we can't be too sure of ourselves. Thanks.
Thanks, April. I think that's a really interesting thought. And I think it's very relevant, particularly in very uncertain and volatile situations, which we find ourselves in today. Maybe some of the solutions have to be innovative. They may not be related to interventions that have happened in the past. We may not immediately be able to determine whether they're effective or efficient, but yeah, I think what you've done is illustrated that complexity is a huge thing that we have to feed into the mix. We're coming towards the end of the session, and I know we've heard a lot from our participants who have had experience of using the DAC criteria, who maybe have carried out evaluations. But I want to hear a little bit about some of those younger evaluators that we have amongst us. We have a lot of emerging evaluators. I wonder whether you could maybe just share with us your thoughts on what you've heard today about the DAC criteria. What do you feel about the usefulness of these set of criteria that we can use to generate questions to focus evaluations? And what would you like to learn more about on this topic? So let's hear from the young and emerging evaluators. Who would like to?
Hello, can you hear me?
Please go ahead, yes.
Yes, I'm called Paul Waiswa. I'm a part of Uganda Evaluation Association, but I'm currently in Timor-Leste. Now, this has been an eye-opener. It's a very nice one, but as we've gone through the criteria, I was just contemplating on the sustainability one. We recently had a scenario in this place where I am. We intervened immensely at the parliament. We constructed a building to assist the parliamentarians, and we've been building capacities of parliamentarians to a big level. However, with the change of government, they are planning to shift the parliament to a new place, implying that our building will almost be obsolete. So every time it comes to sustainability, I keep wondering, as I look at the questions, how best am I going to handle this kind of thing? I mean, there's a new government and new direction. So yeah, the DAC criteria and the questions along very important, very nice, but some contexts are very challenging. That's
thanks for that. That's a really good observation. And as we know, political situations have a huge impact on sustainability and how we measure it. I've got two hands up, one from Paul Waiswa. Would you like to share your thoughts, Paul?
It's just been me, so I'm just off now.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. Let's have some thoughts from Sakeo Motse then. Sakeo, please go ahead.
Why am I not going off?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank you and the other speakers for these very informative presentations. I've really learned a lot as a young and emerging evaluators. I'm a member of Evaluate Pacific, and this is the first time for me to attend a training like this. And I think these 6 criteria are important. And as the first speaker mentioned, that when you look at all those criteria, it will give you a full picture. It provides the different lenses of different perspectives of how we should look at the interventions or the projects. And not only that, with this session that you facilitated, I think it's really important because you helped us to see the practical part of it. And especially just recently when you asked the questions on how to contextualize it, looking back in the context of the Pacific, I think this is really important. And I think one thing that I learned that could take away from here is that the theory of change that we learned yesterday, that's the phase where everybody's identifying the issues and looking at the context, etc. And as an evaluator, we just really have to understand that, to understand the context. And also somebody mentioned here stakeholders, and also the local context, just so that we contextualize how questions, the approaches that we use. For example, we can go to the offices in government and ask with our key informal interview questions and ask them all these questions, but that could will not be appropriate when we go and interview, when we talk to the right holders that lives in the community, which would require us to take another approach. Probably here in the Pacific, it could be a Talanoa sessions where we
that's great. That's really great to hear, Saka. I'm glad that that's been helpful.
Talanoa session. Yeah. So
I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it to a close there because we have run out of time and we've got a tight schedule. So sorry to cut you off, Sakel, but just finally to say thank you so much for everyone to participating in today's discussion. I think it's been really informative. We've had suggestions and insights from across the globe. And please stay on board and welcome to the next session, which will be given by Candice Morkel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kieron. This was a very interactive session.